Like Jim said, we're going to kind of totally switch gears here and continue talking about physiology, but in a very different context. But we'll still bring in some of the prey stuff, so not horribly different, I guess. So a lot of you guys know I'm a sensory ecologist, which means I mostly study sensory systems and how they enable animals to interact with their environment. So what cues are they using for migrating? What are they using for feeding, communication, and that kind of thing. So something that's kind of interesting, I think, about predator sensory systems is that we often think about prey behavior being kind of influenced by these predator sensory systems, although these are often assumptions made without any knowledge of the predator visual system, or sensory systems in general, I should say. So things like you can see here on the screen, we know that bait fish tend to form these big bait balls, and we assume that has something to do with the ability of marlin to pick out an individual fish within this bait ball. We unfortunately don't know much about a lot of these large pelagic predator visual systems. Sorry, this might be a sailfish actually. In any case, we don't really understand how these fish are actually seeing the bait ball, whether this really helps. And this is really true with these large pelagic predators that are very difficult to access. So we have to kind of rely on these assumptions and some behavioral observations to kind of start understanding what's happening here. But as you all know here, OCEARCH has given us a lot of access to animals that sometimes migrate across ocean basins, and so it's very hard for us to get out and pinpoint where a shark might be in order to start understanding this information. So I mentioned there that some sharks can move across ocean basins like we just saw, but as we know from the OCEARCH tracker and some of the data that you guys are presenting here, we know that migrations happen along coasts within an ocean basin. So here we're looking at white shark Savannah that was tagged last year on the Low Country expedition, and Savannah is in orange. This track is a little bit old. She's actually hanging out in the Gulf of Mexico right now. And then next to her is a short fin Mako Oscar that was tagged by Woods Hole. But you can see that both of these sharks are migrating from between the Northeast and down to Florida. And as they make this north-south migration, they're encountering several different types of visual habitats. So for example, Savannah was tagged inshore in fairly greenish, turbid water. But when she's migrating north and south, you can see she gets a little bit closer to that nice clear blue water. So this has a lot of implications for how these sharks can actually see in different parts of their migratory route. Other things that kind of play into this visual ecology that we don't quite understand is it seems like there may be a role of vision in vertical migrations. We don't know that much about the vertical migrations of white sharks. A little bit more has been done on Mako sharks. But like Mike talked about earlier, they do make, both species do make these vertical migrations. So you can kind of see here, let me see if I can do this so both sides can see. So you can see they have some dives here where these points are deep dives down into deeper water. And then all of these points up here are the shark is at the surface of the water. So there's a lot going on in this graph, but what I want to show here is there's a difference, I guess, here. And they make these deep dives, but they also spend time at the surface. So most people that study these patterns are interested in the thermal physiologies of these sharks. So they spend a lot of time talking about how temperature affects these migratory patterns. But what you can see by looking at this graph is that there's a diurnal pattern to these migrations. So the shaded part is nighttime, the white part is daytime. So you can see most of these dives are actually occurring during the day, which suggests there could be some role of the visual system occurring here. Something else that's a little bit newer and kind of been hypothesized, hasn't really been able to be studied too much yet, is there are some old thoughts that these sharks are making dives down into deeper water for foraging, but what we're seeing from some of these papers on Mako sharks is that they actually seem to have more feeding events occurring during the shallow waters at night. So there's a little increase in a little change in stomach temperature here that might be related to a feeding event. So something here is happening a little bit different than what we understand. And so we want to kind of look at these patterns in a visual context. So I chose 2 species to look at in particular for this project. Both of these are lamnid shark species, which means that they, well, they're related to each other, but they are also cranial endothermic, which means that they have the ability to warm their brains and eyes above the ambient temperature. And the primary hypothesis for the evolution of this physiological parameter, I guess, is that the increase in brain and eye temperature above ambient helps them have fast vision in even cold water. So they aren't losing any visual function like most sharks do that don't warm their eyes. But like I said, we don't have very much access to these animals, and this hypothesis is completely untested, but very widely accepted. So this is something we want to get a little bit more knowledge about and understanding about. So what I'm looking at primarily is the sensitivity of these eyes, just to start kind of seeing what might be happening here with these white sharks and Makos, whether they really do have this kind of superior vision that's been thrown out in the literature. So we are mostly looking at eye size as a proxy of sensitivity. And eye size is very important because no matter what's going on physiologically in the eye can't be more sensitive than the amount of light that gets into it. So essentially, a bigger eye can fit a bigger beam of light into the eye than a smaller eye can. So it can collect a lot more light, therefore it can be more sensitive. So this is really important in the ocean when you're losing light with depth, and the colors are changing with depth as well. So eye size could have some implications for these vertical migrations. So what we were able to do is, with some help from Rob and Toby and some other people, we were able to get several photographs of white shark eyes and Mako eyes. I have some data from other projects that is able to incorporate in this, but basically simple protocol. We have a picture of the shark eye and a ruler next to it, and we can just measure the diameter of the pupil. The pupil tells us essentially how much light can get into the eye. Excuse me. So if we plot the white shark next to the Mako shark, this is a kind of boring graph, but basically it tells us something that is not very surprising, that as a shark grows, the eye also grows with approximately a linear relationship. What is more interesting is if you look at the size of the eye of the white shark and the short-fin Mako, they don't really differ in size. So Makos don't have different eye sizes than white sharks. This might change with better sample size. I'm not really sure. Need to get into this a lot more. This is limited to about 10 individuals per species right now, I think. So that's kind of interesting. We expect that white sharks and Makos might have big eyes. You can see that they have big eyes when you look at them, but if they have better vision, they might have really big eyes. But when we compare them to tiger sharks, they don't have bigger eyes than tiger sharks. So if you see tiger sharks, you know they also have bigger eyes. But what is interesting is that they do seem to have potentially bigger eyes than blue sharks. I only have one blue shark sample at this point, so I don't know if this trend is going to hold up. But blue sharks are a really interesting comparison because in the physiology literature with thermal endothermy and physiology, blue sharks are kind of the comparison for these endothermic species. Ecologically, they're fairly similar. Physiologically, they're very different. So this is something we definitely need to look into more if we're trying to figure out if these sharks actually do have better vision. So what we're doing, other than just looking at the actual eye size, is we can incorporate that eye size and estimate the sensitivity of the shark's eye based on how far away that shark can see an object. So here, if we have the shark's visual field here in yellow, the shark is viewing something off in the distance in a horizontal plane. Here we're just using a seal as a target. If we can figure out this distance between the shark and the animal when the shark could see the prey item, it could tell us the sensitivity. So the farther away a shark can see a target, the more sensitive it is to those visual stimuli. So I'm not going to bore you with the math, and I quite frankly don't completely understand it. This is where my collaborator, Sanka Johnson, comes in. He's a really good modeler. But essentially what we're able to do is put in a bunch of environmental parameters and physiological data and morphological data from the shark. So ignoring the equation up here, the important things for this talk and this information are the target, so data about the target. So here we included contrast of the target against the background. Basically 0 means that the target is identical in brightness as the background, so it's not really distinguishable from the background. And usually that's a white target in surface water, whereas 1 is kind of is the highest contrast, and usually in surface water that's something that's black. So we looked at this basically in 10% increases of contrast with the background. We chose a seal partly because of our beloved chewie that acts as a decoy when we're out fishing. I think there are 2 chewies. I have 2 pictures of 2 different chewies. One of them is 0.5 meters long, one of them is 1 meter long. So I used both of these sizes in the model to understand if decoy size or target size affects sensitivity. Theoretically, something that's bigger would be easier to see. Something that's darker would be easier to see. And then finally, we included eye size in the model. So a bigger eye should be able to see one of these targets, one of these combinations of target size and contrast better than the smaller eye. I picked these 2 eye sizes because this is from the smallest shark that I have data for, which was one of the 2017 Montauk sharks. And then the biggest, which I believe was a shark from South Africa, that was about 5 meters long. So nice big range in white shark sizes. These are both white sharks, by the way. So nice big range in shark sizes here. So we found some interesting but not really interesting data or results. So basically what you can see here with this graph, I'm going to show a few of these. We have contrasts along the x-axis, so minimum contrast is always going to be here, and then increasing in those steps till you get to the darkest contrast over here. On the y-axis, this is visual range at the surface. So we're assuming a shark is swimming at the surface of the water in nice, bright conditions where the sun is directly overhead. And what we see is an increase of visual range or sighting distance with contrast. So you can see a darker object farther away. And the maximum visual range at the surface is around 20-25 meters. So this plot here is for the eye for the smallest shark. If we switch this out for the largest shark, there's absolutely no difference in visual sensitivity. And if we look at target size, so right here we're looking at the small target, and then switch to the big target, there's no change in sensitivity. So what this is telling us is at the surface of the water, there's so much light there that increasing eye size doesn't really help that much. So bigger eyes don't necessarily mean better sensitivity in these surface waters. And these guys actually have, I just added this slide thanks to Mike McAllister's talk a little bit ago. The other thing that's really interesting about the data is that Mike was talking about some of the vertical migrations from those little white sharks. And if we look at the y-axis here, this is the depth at which the shark can see a target the farthest away. So at the surface, they can see about 20-25 meters away. When they're diving deeper, the water gets clearer and clearer. They're actually able to see about 70 meters away. And the depth range of that maximum visual distance is close to that maximum depth range of their vertical migration. So they're actually able to see better at about 150 meters than they are at the surface of the water. So it'd be really interesting to start pairing up these tag data more with the vision and sensitivity data. The last thing that I think is pretty interesting that kind of came out of this, going back to eye size, is that if we want to model a surfer or a diver, I guess in this case, we can start thinking about some of these untested shark myths such that sharks attack surfers because they can't tell the difference between a surfer and a seal. And what we see is if you have a diver sees a shark, the diver and the shark can actually see each other at the same distance away, even though our eyes are much smaller. So again, bigger eyes don't necessarily mean better sensitivity. Sanka is not a shark biologist, and he gets freaked out when he sees this because he thinks they're a 100-meter white shark. So he likes me to make sure that you know the shark is not to scale. Another important part of this picture that we haven't been able to test yet is this influence of visual acuity, which is how clear you can see an image. So if there's a diver or a surfer swimming along, sees a shark, the shark would look something like this to the diver. We have pretty good visual acuity. The shark would see something more like this because sharks have poorer visual acuity than us. So if we think about a silhouette of a diver and a seal and put that in the context of what the shark is viewing, there could be some truth to this myth about mistaken identity. We need to do a lot more work to figure out if this is true, but something kind of interesting to start thinking about. The last thing I want to mention is we know that vision has a pretty good role in some behaviors of these sharks. Some work that came out of South Africa talks about foraging ecology of the sharks, and they noticed that sharks line up with the sun directly behind them to maximize contrast of the target with the background. So this target would be really dark to the shark, be easy to see, but the prey item is looking directly into the sun, so it's got glare, and the shark has less contrast. So again, something we need to consider. And finally, I didn't really get to answer the question yet if these lamnid sharks do have a sensory advantage in terms of vision, but just by looking at this picture, you can see this gigantic eye on this Mako and a smaller eye on the blue shark. So we need a lot more data to start figuring this out. If anyone has access to eyes or fishermen that are targeting these species that could help provide samples, please let me know. And then finally, another important part of this is temperature. So thanks to Toby and some other people, we've been able to start getting some thermal images. But unfortunately, what I'm seeing most in these thermal images is what's exciting is there's a nice warm spot here on this shark near the eye. But this warm spot matches this hand right here. So unfortunately, I think this is a mark on the ruler from the hand. So we're going to work on our protocol for this and see if we can get some more exciting data in the future. With that, I'm out of time, I'm pretty sure, but I want to thank Toby for helping collect a lot of the data, the OCEARCH crew, Chris, Fernanda and Ami for helping coordinate things, Rob for taking pictures, funding sources, and I'll take a question if I have one, otherwise see me later.